Hey, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to do a deep dive into compression techniques, looking at everything from beginner surface level stuff all the way down to the secret techniques down at the bottom. So let's get started with surface level. To start off, we have basic threshold and ratio settings and attack and release adjustment. These are the very first things you learn about compressors. Your threshold sets the volume when the compressor kicks in, and the ratio sets how much compression is applied. The attack controls how quickly the compressor clamps down, and the release controls how quickly the compressor lets go. These are things you definitely need to know, so once you learn these, we can move on to the lower steps. At the surface level, we've also got sidechain compression. This allows the compressor to be controlled by the volume of a different track. This way you can have the compressor on your bass be controlled by the kick. Anytime the kick goes above the threshold, the bass will duck under it. Now you've got a basic understanding of the surface level, we're going to move down to intermediate techniques. Starting off with multi-band compression. Multi-band compression splits up the frequency range into different bands like low, medium, and high, and you can use different compression settings on each of those bands. It's like having multiple different compressors on each band, and you can control their dynamics individually. De-essing is also on here. It's a form of multi-band compression, but it's only affecting the high frequencies where the S's and T sounds pop out. You can use this to help tame sibilance in vocals or to reduce the harshness of a hi-hat. Bus compression. Bus compression is a good technique to really glue your mixes together. That's when you put a compressor on a bus that has multiple instruments fed into it so that they all compress at the same time together. For example, you could use it on a drum bus, a background vocals bus, sometimes even the mix bus to get things really loud. And we've got parallel compression. Parallel compression is when you blend a heavily compressed signal in with a dry signal to help fill out some of the quieter parts. This technique is used a lot on drums to fill up the sound and bring up some of the quieter parts. Okay, moving down to advanced techniques. Starting off, we've got upward compression. Upward compression is like the opposite of compression. In normal compression, any signals above the threshold get reduced, but in upward compression, any signals below the threshold get raised. This brings out some of the details and some of the quieter parts, things like vocals and pianos and guitars. You have to be careful with upward compression because it also can bring up any noise or crackling in your signal that was quiet before. Now it's going to be a lot louder. Dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQ is kind of like multi-band compression, but even narrower bands. They can affect very specific frequencies. You can use these to help tame resonances that keep popping up, or any other frequencies that pop up, but you don't want to cut out completely. Optical compression versus FET compression. In these advanced techniques, you'll start using specific compressors for specific jobs. Like an optical compressor uses light to trigger the compressor. These are usually slower but smoother, versus FET compression, which is very fast and aggressive. Knowing when to use these and to not use these in your mix takes a lot of ear training and a lot of listening. Last one in this part is serial compression. Serial compression is when you use multiple compressors in a row, each doing a little bit of the work. For example, on a vocal, you could use a FET compressor with a high threshold to catch the peaks. Then you can follow that with an optical compressor with a lower threshold to smooth out the vocals after the FET's already taken care of the peaks. Using multiple compressors in series is a way to get a much smoother compression sound without one compressor working really hard. Okay, moving down into the deep techniques, we've got New York parallel compression. This is a variant on parallel compression where you use aggressive EQ, saturation, and distortion to really crush up the sound before you blend it back in with the dry signal. This is usually really aggressive and doesn't sound great on its own, but works really well when it's blended in with the dry signal. And compressor keying. This is when the compressor is triggered by a specific frequency key. A simple technique is a high-pass filter if you have a track with a lot of low-end information. That way the compressor will only work on the high-end stuff and not be bogged down by all the low-end. Compressor keying can get really interesting. If you pair it with a dynamic EQ, sidechain it to the drums, then you can get your EQs bouncing with the drum rhythm and get some really interesting effects from your other instruments. Last in deep techniques, we have upward expansion. This is like the inverse of normal compression. Any signal above a threshold is increased instead of decreased. So you can use this to increase the attack on your instruments, really get your drums to punch even harder. Or on tracks that don't have much dynamics, you can increase the dynamics of a track with upward expansion. That's pretty much it for the deep techniques. Now we're moving down into the abyss of secret techniques. Using compression for saturation, that's a pro move. Adding a compressor to the channel with a threshold high enough that it doesn't trigger, and just using that for some subtle saturation. Again, this takes a well-trained ear and a lot of training to be able to hear. Overcompression for distortion. This is the extreme of compression for saturation. By using a compressor with a lot of color and then boosting the input volume until it starts to distort, you can get some interesting effects with distortion and compression running at the same time. And the last thing on here, the most confusing one, is negative ratio compression. Normal compressors have a ratio of 2:1, 4:1, or 8:1, but a negative ratio compression is -2:1 or -4:1. Negative ratio will bend down the volume even if the signal keeps increasing. As the signal gets louder, the volume gets quieter. You can use this similar to parallel compression to fill in the quieter parts of a track without affecting the original transients. That's it for the compression techniques Iceberg. If you have any other compression techniques you think I should add to this, leave them in the comments. Like and follow, I think that's something I'm supposed to say, and I'll see you next time.